Good evening and welcome to the Institute for Human Sciences. A very warm welcome to all of you. Wonderful to see such a turnout this evening. My name is Ivan Vejvoda. I'm a permanent fellow here at the Institute, and I have the honor and pleasure of hosting, moderating and chairing this evening's presentation, which will be on Beyond Empire, Ukraine, Poland, and the End of Moscow's Rule in Eastern and Central Europe, 80 to 91. Most of us were of age, if I can say for the public here, at that time. Some of us were actually in the trenches as well, in this area, living or writing or studying as fellow travelers or participants. So I think we're in for a very engaging discussion this evening. But I'd like to present our fellow here at the Institute, FRANZISKA Davies, who's a professor at the Ludwig Maximilian University in Munich. I have to look because it's a long title for a university. Franziska has been studying Eastern European history for many years, medieval history and philosophy at the University of Munich, so it's her alma mater. She has specialized in Russian and East European studies and wrote her doctorate on this area as well. But she's also a public intellectual. She publishes in journals such as Merkur, Osteuropa, Kritika, and other academic periodicals, as well as the Süddeutsche Zeitung. She also writes a Substack, which she shared with me today. I urge you all to look at it. We can share that as well. And in particular, what's interesting, and we can get into that area in the discussion, is the whole of Germany's approach to Russia, to Europe, and to why there has been a phenomenon that many of us have followed over this past decade of the Russlandversteher. And she has been at the forefront of trying to explain Eastern Europe to counter some of those tendencies. So without further ado, I'd like to invite Franziska to take the floor, and she will speak for about 40 minutes. And I will announce that today, as often we do have a wine and cheese reception where we can continue the discussion with Franziska downstairs in our refectory is too big a word, but restaurant? Refectory, okay. So please, Franziska, and then we'll, of course, have a discussion and a Q&A after she finishes.
Thank you very much. So I'm just going to have to take note by when I should be finished. Okay. So thank you very much for inviting me to IWM. It's always been kind of a dream of mine to come here. So it is quite theatrical to say this, but it is a dream come true. Thank you for your kind introduction, and thank you all for coming tonight. I want to start by talking a little bit about how I got to this topic. So coming from the German academic system, many of you probably know you have to write what is called a Habilitation. And it's always a bit difficult, so what you do so that you can show that on the one hand you're a broad, good historian who can overlook a big field, but at the same time you have to do something completely new. So I did my PhD in the 19th century, Russian imperialism in the 19th century on Tatar history. And so I moved to the 20th century, as you're supposed to do in German academic, in my field, in Eastern European history in Germany. And I wanted to do Ukrainian history, and I also wanted to do Polish history, and I wanted to integrate it into a larger European history. So I was a bit kind of frustrated by this tendency to separate the two, as kind of Ukraine is something that is different and Poland is something different again. So initially my Habilitationsprojekt was about workers' movement in Soviet Ukraine, Poland and Great Britain in the 1980s. I'm pretty sure if that was my project, maybe less people would have come tonight, which is fine, which is totally fine. But then the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, the Russian full-scale invasion of Ukraine happened, and that also made me think very differently about my own field and about the problem of Russocentrism, which we don't only have in public discourse and in the media, but also in academia. And then this idea came up. This is actually the book that I want to write. I want to write a history of the end. Now I have called it Moscow's Rule in Eastern Central Europe. We've all been discussing good titles, so maybe it's also more about the end of the Soviet Union. But anyway, I wanted to take a kind of decolonial approach to the history of this period, because key historical events, upheavals, that herald the end of an era, they produce iconic images. And these iconic images kind of enter cultural memory, also entered cultural memory in the Western world. And one such central event for European history, world history actually, was of course the end of the Soviet Union. So what the kind of iconic images which this brought forth, I think this is one of them. Boris Yeltsin in August 1991 climbing onto one of the tanks in Moscow City Square, where the so-called State Committee for the State of Emergency had attempted to take control of power in Moscow and to basically stop Gorbachev's reform course, which they quite rightly assumed would lead to the end of the Soviet Union. 5 days later, on August 24th, 1991 also, something else happened about 750 kilometers west of Moscow that the Western world hardly noticed. And this was the independence declaration of Ukraine by the Vejvoda Rada in Kiev. I quote from this declaration. In continuation of the 1,000-year tradition of state building in Ukraine, on the basis of the right to self-determination provided for by the United Nations and other international legal documents, the Vejvoda Rada declared that, quote, the independence of Ukraine and the creation of an independent Ukrainian state, Ukraine. And this declaration made explicit reference to what was happening in these days in Moscow, where this, quote, coup d'etat posed a mortal danger to Ukraine. When the news of this declaration of independence reached the outside world, the people who had gathered on what was then called October Revolution Square started cheering, and only 2 days later it was renamed in Maidan Nezalezhnosti, Independence Square, which was already its unofficial name in Kiev prior to the declaration of independence. And this kind of act in Kiev in the summer of 1991 was the final blow to the Soviet Union. It's not the first of the Soviet republics which declared independence. The Baltic states had been kind of at the forefront of doing this. Georgia followed in April 1991. But whereas, of course, unwillingly, as you know, Gorbachev tried to stop Lithuanian independence with brute force, but the Moscow was at a point where it was kind of thinkable for Soviet Union without the Baltic states and without Georgia, but not without Ukraine. So as soon as this happened, it was pretty clear that the state would cease to exist, and this is exactly what happened at the end. It's only about 6 months later, in December 1991, after, to the shock of many in Russia, the population of Ukraine had confirmed in a referendum the choice for independence. One person who did not live to see this day was Vasil Stus. The Donetsk-born poet and Soviet dissident died in 1985 in the Soviet Gulag in Russia as a result of his imprisonment. The theme of his life and his decades of resistance against Soviet power had been Ukraine's right to its own language, its own culture, and its own history. From this position, and this was typical for non-Russian dissident movements in the Soviet Union, he had become a dissident against the Soviet state. In a letter to the Supreme Soviet in 1997, he once again declared his renunciation of Soviet citizenship. I quote, "The publication ban, the permanent denigration of my human and national dignity, the fact that my Ukrainian patriotism was considered a crime against the state, all this makes it impossible for me to see myself as a citizen of the Soviet Union. Being a Soviet citizen means being a slave. I am not made for such a role." Also in 1997, after hard forced labor in a mine in Russia, he returned to Kiev. But only 1.5 years later, in May 1980, he was again put on show trial for his alleged crimes against the Soviet state. But during this time, Stus took careful note about what was happening in Poland, where in August of 1980, a strike began at the Lenin shipyard in Gdansk that would go down in history as the Solidarność movement. In an alliance with the Catholic Church and a number of Polish intellectuals and dissidents, the strikers succeeded in achieving something that was supposed to be impossible in a socialist state in Eastern Europe and Eastern Central Europe, the establishment of an independent trade union. What had begun as a strike for better working and living conditions expanded within a few weeks and months into a comprehensive protest movement against the communist regime in Poland. Quote, "I followed the developments in Poland during my time in Kiev," wrote Stus. Again, he was back in the Gulag by this point, a few years before his death. "Long live the champions of freedom. I admire the Polish spiritual victors and regret that I am not Polish. Poland is a milestone in the totalitarian world and is preparing its downfall. But will the Polish example find imitators? That is the question." He, Stus, did not know, he wrote this down, how the events in Poland would be perceived in Ukraine and the Soviet Union, but he was nonetheless certain that Poland could be an example for Ukraine. Almost exactly 11 years later, after the workers' dependence at the Lenin shipyard began, the parliament in Kiev declared Ukraine's independence. And when this was approved by a large majority of the population in the quoted referendum a few months later, 2 countries immediately recognized Ukrainian independence: Canada and, you will guess, Poland. And this book addresses the question that Stus did not know an answer to in the final years of his life. How were the events in Poland perceived in Ukraine? What effect did the protests against state socialism have? How did relations between Ukraine and Poland develop in the 1980s? And why was, of all countries, Poland the one to first recognize the independence of Ukraine? After all, Western Ukraine had been part of the Polish state until 1939. The city of Lviv, or Lwów in Polish, was considered for many decades, centuries actually, a Polish city. And the so-called Kresy, the former eastern regions of the Rzeczpospolita and the Second Polish Republic of the interwar period were central to Polish nationalism and to the Polish national myth. During the Second World War, the two kind of Ukrainian and the Polish national movement were really at odds with each other, to put it mildly. The organization of the Ukrainian nationalists and its military arm, the Ukrainian Insurgent Army, killed up to 70,000 Polish civilians in Volhynia, and in turn the Polish underground army, Armia Krajowa, took vengeance also on Ukrainian civilians who died also in high numbers. So the fact that Poland not only recognized immediately Ukraine's independence, but also became a resolute advocate for Euro-Atlantic and European integration of Ukraine in the 1990s and the 2000s. I mean, it's not a matter of course, given this extremely violent history. But while the Franco-German reconciliation is rightly considered one of the most important pillars of European reconciliation after the Second World War, of the European security order of Europe in general, I would argue that the history of Ukrainian-Polish reconciliation is not only undertold, but also under-researched. So I talked about why I also had this idea for this book when I started to think a lot more about the colonial legacies of my own field. And now I'm going to do a short excursus, that's what we say in German, into why I think we need this. And I'll take two books, well actually particularly one book as an example, but these are, in my opinion, two prominent examples, or one is more prominent than the other, but anyway, two examples of a very colonial history of the end of the Soviet Union. You see on the left the book by Władysław Żubok, which was published by Yale University Press in 2021. Żubok is a professor of international history at the LSE, at the London School of Economics, and Walter Sperling, a colleague of mine from Germany, published a book about the end of the Soviet Union, which she placed in Grozny, of all places. And both are, in my opinion, examples for an extremely colonial view of the end of the Soviet Union, very Russocentric, and actually to some extent, especially Walter's book, romanticizes the Soviet Union. But I'm going to focus on Zubak because you can show more about my field with Zubak's book. So if I sum up this big book, it's that he argues that the disintegration of the Soviet Union could have been stopped if only Gorbachev had used violence. That's basically the point of this book. And it's also, this is also already, I would argue, quite problematic. But I would like to give you big and small examples of the kind of colonial discourse which is noticeable throughout the book. So one thing is empire is constantly put into quotation marks. So you would say, okay, if you don't think it's an empire, if you think the Soviet Union is not an empire, please tell us why. But he doesn't. He just says, this whole empire thing is strange. Quotation marks. And I also liked, well, not really liked, but it's a good example. This sentence from the first page. Archives and libraries in Russia and other countries provided me with what individual memoirs could not. So I checked in the index which strange other countries who are not Russia he meant. And it turns out it was Ukraine, Britain, and the United States of America. Then, from the middle of the book, again, quote, in Ukraine, a group of writers and intellectuals in Kharkov prepared the first conference of the People's Movement of Ukraine for Perestroika. They vocally supported the Baltic denunciation of the German-Soviet Pact, although it was because of this agreement that Western Ukraine was annexed and became part of the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. I'm not saying that this is not true, but this is the only thing he says about the German-Soviet Pact in this time. And so he doesn't dwell on the question why maybe from a Ukrainian and Baltic perspective this pact could have other aspects which would make it worth of denunciation from their perspective. Then another quote, the Balts took matters into their own hands. The Russian miners' strike emboldened them and strengthened their case. He's talking about the year 1991 here, and these Russian miners' strikers, actually to a large part from Ukraine. They're in Donbass. Then next one, quote again, for the Russians, Ukraine was like Scotland to the English, only closer. From the Russian perspective, Ukraine was filing for divorce without a settlement. This Russian mindset was bound to clash with Ukrainian nationalism and become a source of great tension and trouble for decades to come. Okay, I'm just going to leave that with you. So we can maybe talk about it later. And okay, you could say, okay, published by Yale University Press, by an eminent scholar in our field, not good, but happens. But then you take a look at the reviews. And about, I would say, 80% of them are very positive. And the book gets a round table. And I'm just going to quote, I could go on forever, but I won't, because it's not that interesting. Or that nice. But I'll just give you two examples, both by academics who reviewed this book after the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. That's maybe also important to know. So, quote from one review. The book will be of great interest to everyone interested in global politics. Okay. Amongst other things, it provides important background knowledge about the causes of Russia's 2000 annexation of Crimea and 2022 invasion of Ukraine. And it's exactly what this book does. It does not explain this. The other one, Zubak offers alternative ways of thinking about Russian President Vladimir Putin's bellicose actions today. Through his careful analysis of the unresolved circumstances surrounding the 1990-1991 Russo-Ukrainian split after 300 years of the two nations' union from 2023. So when you do the math, she's talking about the split in 1919, after 300 years of the nation's union. You're back in the 17th century. So she's completely reproducing this myth of the two nations merging in the 17th century, which nobody thought in the 17th century. It's an invention of the 19th century by Russian imperialism. And it's used today to legitimize the genocidal war. So this is what I want to not do, basically. But I would also like to get shortly, I'm sure we'll also talk about this in this discussion, about this whole discussion about decolonization. Because of course decolonization, post-colonialism, they're academic terms, they're analytical terms, but they're also politically charged terms. And that makes dealing with them very difficult. But at least when I look at my field, you see two classical, but where, I mean, it's not like people only started in after February 2022 becoming interested or calling for the decolonization of our field, but it's the point where people actually, to some extent, started listening, where it became a larger debate. And from what I can see, there are two classical arguments against a decolonial approach or decolonization of our field. Number one is exactly that to link it to political activism. To say, okay, people who are, colleagues of mine did this in the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung in August 2022, Robert Kindler, Sören Obanski, and Tobias, I know his name, but I forgot it right now. Anyway, these three people, colleagues of mine, they say it's post-colonial activists are doing this. And I don't think that's a serious argument, to just kind of label your colleagues who are calling for decentering Russian perspectives that they're political activists. It's a delegitimizing strategy without actually engaging in their analytical arguments. And these is really about questioning the structures and how of our field, and how they were shaped by the history of colonialism. In the case of Germany, also by the history of German-Russian colonialism at the expense of East and Central Europe. So this question is, what languages do we learn? Which countries do we go to when we do our undergraduate degree? Which archives do we go to? Because that's what the language we've learned, and that's the language we can deal with. This is really I think this is what decolonization is about, to engaging critically with how the colonial history of Europe and East and Central Europe structures and still influences to this day our field and our thinking. And the second counter-argument is decolonization will lead to national master narratives. And my answer is, why? Very often it's not actually said why this should happen. Very often it's just assumed that this is what's going to happen. If you try to decolonize the field, you will end up with kind of 19th century style master narratives of national survival. And I just do not think that's the case. I mean, it's not about ignoring what happened in Russia. It's not about ignoring Russian sources, but it's about broadening our source base and also including the voices of the colonized, which are for structural and historical reasons either considered less important or not that easy to find, quite simply. So I can talk if you want. I'm not going to do it now, but in my PhD, that was a problem. I did learn Tatar, but it's difficult to learn Tatar in Germany, and then to find the sources. It's easier to learn Russian, and to just do the whole thing with the Russian sources. So this is what I want to do in this book, broadening the perspective. Okay, that's too early, sorry. So a history of Polish-Ukrainian interdependence that examines the preconditions of Polish-Ukrainian relations in the 1990s and 2000s. I think the 1980s is actually a critical period for this. And it also actually helps us understand, I mean, you could obviously go even further back than the 1980s, but one of the kind of structural legacies of the Soviet Union is also this tendency for a long time to always analyze Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus together. Like there was some kind of a need to always think these three countries together, which of course is also kind of dangerously close to this Russian myth that these three nations combined are the great Russian, or are the Russian nation. But also, and so I think to look at the late 1980s or the 1980s, and not only at kind of the top level, which is what this very important book by Serhii Plokhy does. He does really look at the importance of Ukraine for the disintegration of the Soviet Union, but he's very much concerned with kind of the top leaders, with Gorbachev, with Kravchuk, Nazarbayev, and Bush Sr. That's the kind of top level he's interested in. But I would also like to look at kind of the societal dimension. I would want to look at the transnational networks and perception of upheavals and protest movement in Ukraine and Poland between the 1980s and 1991. But I would also like to look, at least to some degree, at perceptions. So why is solidarity a huge thing in the Western world, and the Ukrainian movement for independence and the Declaration of Independence is basically overlooked? I can't do this for the whole of the Western world, but I want to do it most specifically for Germany and also Great Britain, because I've also done a lot of work on that before. Okay, now this is like tentatively the structure of the book. Very much open for debate right now, but that's what I'm doing. But since I've only written the first chapter and started the second, there's still much possibilities to completely otherwise when you now tell me that this is not a good idea. And I want to do now kind of dive into some of the sources I've been looking at for the third chapter. So Ukrainian-Polish relations in the 1980s, and perhaps you've already noticed that I'm like more firmly standing in Ukrainian history. But the title doesn't really give that away, but you know, I consider myself much more historian of Ukraine than in Poland, than a historian of Poland, but I do think this relationship is really crucial to understand Ukraine in this period. So, but I have done research in Poland, and the solidarity and underground discourse on Ukraine. So in the legal period of solidarity, and then in the after it gets it's kind of banned officially in December 1981, also in the underground press, one idea is very prominent, that Ukraine must become an ally of Poland. And this is not completely new. I mean, Polish intellectuals have been arguing for this already after 1918, then after 1945. It's also a topic in the Polish diaspora. But still, it is really a topic of also in solidarity, and there's this formula, which is also the title of Krystyna Szuszak's book on this topic. There is no free Poland without a free Ukraine. So this is kind of the idea that many of these solidarity intellectuals voice. I'm going to cite one example of numerous examples from 1981, an anonymous article, sadly, in Tygodnik Mazowsze, which starts with a poem by Taras Shevchenko, the 19th century Ukrainian national Poland, which is entitled "To the Poles," and in which he kind of has this romantic idea of Ukraine and the Ukrainian Cossacks and the Poles in the early modern period actually being brothers in their fight for freedom. So very much romanticized history. And then the article starts with this sentence, which I find really interesting. We do not have a border with Russia, but with Belarus and Ukraine. And I find it interesting because this author thinks he has to say this. Because you would think, well, if it's completely obvious, he wouldn't have to say it. Yeah. So I think this is also very interesting. But then there's also, I mean, a lot of this is, of course, very romanticized. You know, the article stresses the common heritage of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. It sees Ukrainians as fighters for freedom, but it also displays really a knowledge of Russification policies also in Soviet Ukraine, of Holodomor and the slaughter of the Ukrainian intelligentsia in the 1930s, the executed Renaissance, as it becomes remembered. And it's also very critical towards Poland in the Second Polish Republic. I quote, primitive nationalist policy towards minorities alienated Ukrainians from Poland, and then it takes up a formula which is also you find in Polish-German relations: we forgive and ask for forgiveness. And this idea of an alliance between Poland and Ukraine is, of course, also something which is linked to the vision of a specific idea of Poland. Distancing themselves from this kind of chauvinistic and nationalist Poland of the Second Republic, but also to more conservative Polish intellectuals in that time, and saying, a liberal future Poland would have to be a Poland where, I quote, Ukrainian ash trees and poplars could grow. It's also, of course, about a common enemy, about this Russian imperialism in the kind of disguise of the Soviet Union. But I think it's also about more than this, and this becomes clear when you look at the actual people who are arguing this way. And one very prominent example is Jacek Kuron, who is one of them who is arguing along these lines. And he is, of course, from Lviv. This is where he was raised. I'm not quite sure whether he was born there, but he was definitely raised there. And in his memoirs, he talks about this. And I'm going to quote a passage from these memoirs. I quote, "Lviv was a city of Poles, Jews, Ukrainians, a city of stark contrast. I had grown up in the cult of the eagles. I sang for Lviv Poland's children want to fight. I sang for Lviv Poland's children want to fight, endure blows, pain, and death. But I was fascinated by what was different, what was foreign. When I passed the Ukrainian school, I was drawn to it. I remember exactly what tipped the scales in favor of me, what tipped the scales in favor of Ukrainians. In the past, I would have said internationalism, which sounds strange today, but now I would say universalism. The father of my two friends, a fanatical nationalist, had said to me, "Your father's partner is Ukrainian business partner." He was a likable man called Chaika and worked with my father in the National Army. He told me Jack London, and I liked his version even better than the original. And I came to my father and asked, "Dad, is this Chaika, is he Ukrainian?" And father says, "Him not, but me, yes." At first, I thought he was joking, but he confirmed it to me in all seriousness. I was blown away and believed him. I agonized over it for a whole day. In the evening, when I had almost come to terms with it, I went to him to ask for details, and he said, "No, I'm not Ukrainian. I told you so that you would know that it's just coincidence whether someone is born Ukrainian, Polish, or Jewish. Pure coincidence. I could also be Ukrainian." That was a revelation, and to this day, it is an indisputable fact for me. Now I want to kind of turn around and look at Ukrainian perceptions of Poland in the same period, specifically perceptions about Solidarność. I have one problem here. It's just the wide difference between what was possible to say in Poland in that period and in Ukraine. So in Poland, they have like this underground archive, which is huge, and you know, you're just kind of swimming in sources. And in Soviet Ukraine, what you were able to say was still like much more limited before Gorbachev's ascent to power. So you do have this asymmetry. What you do, of course, have are official reports on the reactions to Solidarność in Soviet Ukraine. And most of these sources, most of them from Western Ukraine, give the impression that Ukrainian society was rather hostile to solidarity. The authorities were very aware of what was happening in Poland, and they were also slightly paranoid about it, especially about Polish tourists coming to Western Ukraine and then bringing all this kind of solidarity nonsense to the Soviet Union, and would maybe also infect like the Ukrainian nationalists, whom they were also obsessed about in Western Ukraine, in this, not only in this period. I'm going to give you one very typical example from October 2nd, 1980. It stated that, I quote, "The majority of workers in the Republic have correctly assessed the events in Poland." So what were Ukrainians thinking according to this report? They thought what was happening in Poland was, quote, "a class struggle of the enemy against socialism." Quote, "a violation of Leninist norms." And then to back this up, these officials would do what nowadays I think journalists call vox populi, so kind of street bites from people from the street. So I have one quote from a driver at the Kirov metal factory in the Donetsk region. Quote, "In my opinion, the unrest in Poland arose because the government of this country showed weakness, played democracy, fought with Democrats, hostile elements, people who openly and with impunity opposed the socialist system with the religion and kulak elements in the village." It's just like you would expect a truck driver from Donetsk to speak every day. At the same time, they would have increased surveillance of Polish tourists in this period. And they were constantly associating them with I quote, "speculations and anti-Soviet sentiments towards locals and how they were kind of influencing the locals." Among these people were the married couple Anna and Marek Górak, both born in the 1950s, who, this is what the Communist Party of Ukraine says, told the people in Lviv as they passed through that, I quote, "the entire Polish people were just waiting for the Pope's visit. And then all of Poland would rise up, and there would be nothing Moscow could do. And if there should be bloodshed, so much the better. And the proposal from the Lviv branch of the Communist Party was just to completely ban Polish tourists from traveling by bus, because then they could get out and talk to people, and just put them all in trains, and so they could just go through Soviet Ukraine without talking to anybody. And of course, it's difficult. What do you do with these sources? Yeah, how do you interpret them? And there is actually one colleague who's written about this, beginning of Vejvoda, and I disagree. Yeah, let me just shortly, and I think it's also in a way an example how certain, I don't want to individualize this problem. I think it's like a structural issue with my field. He basically argues that he does say, well, you can't actually tell the real farts, quote, from these sources, but then he pretty much does that. So, for example, he says, quote, for most Soviet citizens, solidarity appeared not as a challenge to state socialism and a potential source of inspiration for the entire bloc, but rather as a Polish national movement that deepened Eastern Europe's economic problems and threatened the USSR's hold over its outer empire. And I think it's very difficult to come to this rather radical conclusion if you only have sources produced by a dictatorial state, which is of course also reporting Moscow the fruits of their own work. Yeah, we have things under control here in Ukraine, nothing to worry about. We have everything under control. And it's also, I would say, and he actually says this, as an inspiration for his work on Soviet Ukraine, he cites Stephen Kotkin's book on the forging of Magnitogorsk, a hugely influential book in the field of Eastern European studies. And Kotkin was interested in what made Bolshevik identity. So very interested in what keeps empires together. And you couldn't really argue in the 1980s anymore that people were all about the Bolshevik project. So Vejvoda now says it's Soviet Ukrainian patriotism. This is what's happening, basically, but I think it's very much influenced by this whole interest, which is more about what keeps empires together, rather what is that challenges them. And but of course, even if we look at the actual sources, so not connected to Solidarność. If we just look at the sources between 1980 and 91, what issues citizens of Ukraine addressed the Communist Party of Ukraine met? It's not Leninist norms. It's not socialism. It's housing, healthcare, pure survival, rising prices. This is what like everyday life is about. And you do, of course, also find hints about anti-Polish resentment or negative rumors, and my book is not about denying any of this, but rather about balancing it with other sources and looking more critically at sources which are produced by the Soviet Union. If you look at these letters to the authorities, they do not tell a story of satisfaction with life in the Soviet Union or Soviet patriotism, or a high degree of political identification with it. I'll give you just one example. I have two, but I'm already talking for quite a while, so I'm just going to give you one. A letter from the Neznamenko family. She says, its mother's writing this, there is a constant talk of, quote, 5-year plans and how well they are going. In fact, we are, quote, living worse and worse every year. And this woman writes to the Communist Party in Kiev. I remember how we talked and wrote about it at school. We will overtake and catch up with the United States. I wonder if we have caught up or overtaken the US, by how many percentage points. In America, the poor look for food in the garbage and live. And we have nothing to look for in our garbage. Our garbage is poor too. I'm not writing this because I'm against the Soviet system. I have 5 children, a big family, and that has an honorable place in the Soviet Union. So, I mean, this is not really speaking of satisfaction or Soviet Ukrainian patriotism from the same period. And also even sometimes in the same documents where Ukrainian Communist Party officials are saying, oh, everything's going fine, everything's under control, people of Ukraine are completely correctly assessing events in Poland, they would also sometimes admit that they don't actually know. So they would also sometimes quite ironically, in the same document, they will also say, we don't actually know because people just listen to BBC and Voice of America and Radio Free Europe all the time, so they're not reading the Soviet press about Poland. And they also admit there's nothing they can do about it. So what other documents do we have about Ukrainian perceptions of Solidarność? And another important group are Ukrainians in the diaspora. And they are also important because this is a period, and it starts already in the 1960s actually, with different phases, but that this writings produced in the Ukrainian diaspora in the West do reach Soviet Ukraine, and are there read by Soviet Ukrainian dissidents and intellectuals. One such magazine, Sushasnist, was published in Munich, but was also read by certain small circles in Soviet Ukraine. And there's one example, a typical example, because this magazine took very, very precise notice about what was happening in Poland in the 1980s. And in an article in 1981, with the author Miroslav Prokop, born in 1913, said, I quote, "When future historians study the cause of the fall of the system of enslavement imposed on these people, the people being the people of the Eastern Bloc and Soviet Union, they will see of the events of last year in Poland as an important stage in the growth of the liberation forces of the peoples enslaved by Moscow, and as an indicator of the decline of the imperial structure of the USSR and its satellites." He argued that the Poles had, quote, "found an effective model for the fight against totalitarianism." And then he, of course, also asked the obvious question from his perspective, what does this mean for Ukraine? He also says, well, there's a lot of things you can't compare, and a lot of differences between Poland and Ukraine. Ukraine really is subjected to Russification. He says Poland has a state and is not, as Ukraine, a, quote, Russian province. But still, he says, the, quote, contemporary political thinking of Ukraine does not differ greatly from that in Poland and other countries of the Soviet Union and the satellite states. What I also found noteworthy about this, when we think back to what I said at the beginning about the Polish-Ukrainian history, is that Miroslav Prokop was a member of the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists in the interwar period, that he was responsible for UN propaganda during the Second World War, and he fled to to southeastern Ukraine, I'm sorry, after the mass arrest of UN members in Galicia in 1941. And so he comes from this extremely nationalist milieu, but then becomes very interested in the 1980s in Poland and sees it as a model for Ukraine, and basically interviews all, or not only him, but the journal where he's writing, interviews all of the leading Polish solidarity intellectuals in that time, always with this question, how can we get this happening in Ukraine, basically? How can this happen in Ukraine? Okay, so this was like a short dive into parts of this chapter. And I've already talked about this with colleagues, and they have given me great feedback. And one criticism also, and like legitimate criticism, is that you're only talking about these intellectuals, right? When you talk about Polish, Ukrainian intellectuals getting interested in Polish intellectuals and Polish intellectuals getting interested. So it's only these intellectuals. But I would say it's still central for this topic and for the questions I'm interested in for two reasons. Because these Solidarność intellectuals and their attitudes to Ukraine, I mean, these are the people who come to power in the 1990s. So their meetings also with Ukrainians, their ideas, their exchanges shape at least a part of the establishment. Of course, now I'm kind of talking about the very liberal camp of solidarity. Their ideas and their networks are to some degrees formed with Ukraine in the 1980s. And of course, and this was not specific to Ukrainians, it was also something that the West was quite fascinated by, is that what fascinated them about solidarity, as many others, was this alliance between intellectuals and the working class. And of course, that's also in a way what then happened in 1989 when the workers of the Donbass first came out for economic reasons, but then in the course of time came out for Ukrainian independence. And Ruch partnered with them. And I want to be very clear that I'm not trying to say they only did this because they watched Solidarity, but it's still one of these things they really seriously discuss with their Polish colleagues, because then we're already in a period where much more is possible, Budowa and so on is happening, but this I think is the alliance with Poland, or with certain Polish intellectuals, the sympathies and the fascination with Solidarity, and that it succeeded is one of the reasons for their strategy. And I also, on a more broader level, it's something to think about how geography shapes political imagination. So I have a colleague and friend who's a historian of Kazakhstan. And she, I'm going to, Butakos Kazanbekova, I'm going to say her name because I owe so much intellectually to her. But she was saying this to me. So from a Kazakh perspective, what the Ukrainians are doing in 1991 is actually incredibly brave. Now, just saying, no, we can do this without Moscow. And there are many reasons for this. There's a very long tradition of struggle for your own statehood and so on. But it's also, it seems possible. You have your neighbor is striving then later in the 1990s for EU membership, for NATO membership, which kind of changes the political imagination of what is possible also for Ukraine. And for Kazakh, and even today, I mean, I'm not a specialist on Georgia, but besides maybe somebody in our in this room is, there's also, of course, also this dream of becoming part of European Union, but it seems so much further away, and it is further away. It very practically is further away, and the Polish-Ukrainian border was one of the most permeable borders in between the satellite countries and the Soviet Union. And maybe this is something I'm still very much thinking about, but maybe it also has something to do with the hierarchies in the Soviet Union. I mean, in an ideal world, I could speak Kazakh and I could speak Georgian and I could think all of this together, but sadly I can't. But I can read what my colleagues write about these countries. But from a Kazakh perspective, not sure about Georgia, but from a Kazakh perspective, which where you also, of course, have these forgotten moments. Yeah? When students in 1986 in Alma-Ati go out to protest against Gorbachev's decision to put an ethnic Russian who knows nothing about Kazakhstan in charge of the Soviet Republic of Kazakhstan, they come out and protest. It's one of really large student protests against Soviet policies, and it's crushed and it's forgotten. I mean, the pictures, like we're talking about pictures, nobody has this picture of Kazakh students coming out in Alma-Ati when they think about the end of the Soviet Union. But what I'm actually trying to get at with this is that there's this structure from a Kazakh perspective that Ukrainians and the Ukrainian communist apparatus was the second important after the Central Communist Party. I mean, we of course didn't have a Russian Communist Party, just kind of the Central Communist Party. But and this is not about saying Ukrainians. When you say Ukrainians were privileged with their access to power in comparison to Kazakhs, it's not to say they were less victims to Soviet Russian colonialism or colonial violence. Obviously, they, to the contrary, were really experienced this violence. But it also perhaps means, I'm very much thinking only about this, haven't actually written this down, that there is a self-confidence to say we can do this without Moscow, which perhaps Kazakh elites lacked in this period. Okay, but in conclusion, I'm a little over, after 45 minutes I think now. I'm just going to show you something else, just because I love these sources so much. Because of course I'm not only going to look at intellectuals, I'm also in the process of looking at subcultures. I have two wonderful examples. So number one, sorry, I didn't translate this into English, but you have Alik Oleksievich, and I'm afraid you can't see it, but the little badge he's wearing is a Solidarność badge. And he was given this, according to his friends, in 1985, after he met, you guessed it, Polish tourists in Lviv. So the Communist Party was right; they were very dangerous. And he had jeans, and he painted Solidarność onto his jeans before the Soviet authorities took these genes away from him a couple of months later. And then there's also fascinating examples in like this kind of Ukrainian-Polish subculture, and a completely different take, a very ironic take on Ukrainian-Polish relations. This is I believe, a punk magazine that Ukrainian youths in Poland, there's still a Ukrainian minority in Poland, published in 1990, and where they just make complete fun of this whole Polish-Ukrainian discourse. And they have an article which is called, they just reduce the whole violent relationship between these countries to absurdity. So one article in one of these issues is called "The Heinous Ukrainian Masonic Conspiracies Against Poles," and it's completely absurd. It's completely absurd, and it's this very ironic take on all these nationalist discourses. But at the same time, I think it's also a clear reference to the Orange alternative in Poland in the 1980s, which also resisted against state socialism by just taking it completely to absurdity. So this is just to let you know that I'm not only working on like intellectuals, but also trying to find other areas of relations, dialogue between Poland and Ukraine from 1980 to 1991. Thank you.
Franziska, thank you very much for that extremely wealthy, thought-provoking, history-provoking, analytically provoking approach that keeps the breadth of your approach very clear, although you have this direction which has been clearly understood that you want to rectify some of the things that have been said. There are a multitude of issues that I think we'll all address. I will just ask you one question before I open it to the audience. I'm sure there's a lot of interest to probe a lot of things that you've said. And this is maybe a footnote or somewhat lateral. The period that you're talking about, of course, is the heyday of dissidents in Central and Eastern Europe. Of course, you mentioned Kuroń, that some of us actually met and talked to, and the Michniks, and of course Czechoslovakia with Havel, and then Hungary with a number of George Conrad and the Budapest School, and the meetings on the Czech-Polish border, where there was a lot of this exchange on how we would, how they would look at the future. And I'd like to mention in conversations that I was lucky to have with Havel and Adam Michnik, they would always start by saying, knowing that I came from former Yugoslavia, they said Yugoslavia is really what we were looking at as a possibility, staying within communism but being somewhat freer. What were the contacts, if any, between Ukrainians and others? And you mentioned the Polish connection, but was there an insight into the literature, into the thinking? Of course, we need to mention the Soviet Warsaw Pact invasion of Czechoslovakia.
Yeah.
And I'm sure that's something that Ukrainians thought a lot about, and I'm sure Ukrainian soldiers were also, as part of the Red Army, partook in that.
So yes, there were. I mean, there's also a bit of this problem when you're interested in like a specific context. That's obviously just what I look more at, to like the meetings with the reading of Polish intellectuals, but the whole debate, the tragedy of Central Europe, which of course also included Czech, Slovak, Hungarian dissidents, they were very well aware of this debate, and I mean, one of the people who then in the 1990s becomes a very vocal advocate for already at that point for European integration of Ukraine is Yuri Andruchowicz, the writer, and he talks about this. I mean, he writes about this, but we've agreed to have an interview, so he's going to tell me more. But he also writes about this in his publications, that this whole debate, reading Kundera, reading Georgi, also reading the Polish intellectuals, but he read them all, so to speak. And also with some degree of frustration that Ukraine was left out. Because this, I mean, it was very much, there's an occasional reference to Ukraine in these debates, but it's very much kind of an Eastern Central Europe, or Central Europe, which doesn't necessarily include Ukraine, or in which Ukraine also isn't really considered that important for this debate. As for the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia and the role of the Red Army, and by this also the role of Ukrainian soldiers, I haven't yet. It's not a big topic, and it's also a topic which comes much later. So maybe in 1989, 1990, so when there's much more freedom to discuss. But then again, in this period, also other topics are much more important. Like Holodomor is much more important. So the kind of the own history of violence and victimhood and the things that happen to you and your own family are at that point more important than reckoning with the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia.
So before I open it, I cannot withhold my surprise at Zubok's maintenance that violence would have solved the Soviet Union. That shows total misunderstanding of every kind of social and political dynamic that the Soviet Union went into. Basically, Gorbachev understood that the party is over, and so let's cut our losses and do this my way, right? But anyway, I'll open it to the floor now. I'm sure, okay, first question over there. Who's got the microphone? Right, could you raise your hand? So, yeah, right there. And could you please introduce?
Was never the first one. This is a new experience for me. Thank you very much. My name is Dietmar Bichler. I'm the initiator of the Disinfo Resilience Network. Thank you very much for your very interesting speech, and especially your work against Russian narratives in Germany, because you mentioned a lot of things that are not social media, not online. You mentioned the classrooms, the universities, and also mainstream media. And I also try to put some awareness on this, and I struggle very much. My question to you is, with all your work you have done in the German-speaking world, do you think there is a breakthrough? Do people suddenly somehow understand what is going on, or do they still think Russian influence is just Telegram?
Yeah, I think we do still have to distinguish between the two things. What I'm really not saying is that or most of my colleagues are spreading pro-Russian propaganda. It's far from what I was trying to say. I mean, that of course happens a lot in the media, and I don't have to tell you about how this happens. I think the issue in academia is more that the kind of the structural legacies of Russian colonialism are not adequately reflected. It's not a conscious information war or anything. It's nothing to do with that. It's nothing to do with the Russlandversteher. Well, it maybe has something to do with it, but it's a different category. It's not like these Russlandversteher. They were, I mean, the Russlandversteher were ironically people who really didn't know anything about Russia, basically. You know, that's what one of the things that characterized them is that with few either like full-blown pro-Russian propagandists or some lost German journalists who couldn't speak a word of Russian, and that's obviously not the case in academia. So I'm going to answer your question about academia, because I think that's our topic tonight. And I can only really speak to my own experience, and it's difficult. I think for a number of reasons. A great colleague of mine, Anna Veronika Wendlers, who's a historian of Ukraine, and she's like the generation before me, so to speak. She once said to me, the problem with a convention is that those who follow it don't notice that it's a convention. And I think that's part of it. And it's also, when I think of my own kind of involvement, I had a very classical way towards Eastern Europe. I read Dostoevsky and liked him as a teenager. Don't like him anymore.
Perfect.
But you know, this is just the kind of where you go, what you study, how subconsciously, and when I went to a bookshop as a teenager because I wanted to read Russian classics, there was no section Ukrainian classics. And these are more like the structural issues which lead you to your topics, lead you to your narratives, lead you to your understanding. And I think that's what we have to address. And I think it's difficult to address, for one thing, because we are so, especially perhaps, is this still being recorded? I'm going to get in a lot of trouble.
Yes,
Okay. Sometimes I think this is just like a hypothesis, because basically this is a question you should ask a historian in 20 years who's going to research this period and how academia dealt with it. But sometimes I think it's harder for specialists on Russia because they're so used, they've done this for so long. They've stuck to the convention to see events from primarily from a Moscow or Petersburg perspective for so long. It's harder to leave that behind because it's tied to your academic achievements, it's tied to your personal biography. So just like perhaps my generation, or some in my generation, or all of them, are now very much influenced by Russia's war against Ukraine, the older generations was very much influenced by Gorbachev. And that was kind of what influenced their thinking. And it's tied to your biography, and it's painful to overcome sometimes. So that's the nice interpretation, I understand that, but I still think it's necessary, because our Ukrainian colleagues are really fighting for the survival of their country, and the least we can do as Western academics is to address our own blind spots and our own mistakes. It takes much less bravery than what Ukrainians are doing right now. And the second thing is less nice, because I think it's also for some about, I mean, I would say now it's a, there is still a structural and intellectual hegemony in my field from Russia specialists. And to give that up also means giving up power, institutional power, funding, renaming programs from Russian studies into Eastern Central studies or Ukrainian studies, which perhaps is not something you want to do because you're a Russia specialist. And I can only give you anecdotal evidence because I've not actually researched this. I can only speak from my own experience, but I'm a co-founder of RUTA, which is kind of we're trying to be kind of an alternative to the Association of Slavic and Eastern European Studies, which gives this prize to Zubok. And we were we had our opening conference near Uzhhorod last year, and I was like, oh, okay, if we don't get into the established journals, we'll do our own, and you know, we have to change the discourse. And this woman who was 20 years older than me, specialist on Ukraine, said to me, we've been doing that for 3 decades, it's never worked. And I was like, oh, God, you know, a lot of work to do.
Misha, and then Clemena.
I'm just wondering, in terms of sources, Franziska, there were a series of publications in the late 70s and early 80s. Gegenstimmen here in Austria, Osteuropa in Germany, Labour Focus on Eastern Europe in the United Kingdom. And Labour Focus in particular concentrated on publishing documents as well as testimonies. There was a lot of material from Ukraine, a huge amount from Poland, but actually it's material that I have never seen replicated anywhere. And Labour Focus was particularly concerned to document any strikes or other types of unrest that was going on in Ukraine, in Poland, in Czechoslovakia and elsewhere. And I just wonder if you'd had a look at any of those publications, simply because it has material from everyday experiences and political reflections that, as I say, I haven't seen anywhere else at all.
Well, I have to give a short, embarrassing answer to that. I have not looked at this. I have looked at like the diaspora publications, which often are also like actually from Ukraine, but they're kind of then published in this kind of circle movement, and they're published in North America, and then they go back to Ukraine. But not yet these Austrian collections. So thank you very much.
Well, the most important one is Labour Focus, which was actually the United Kingdom, and they were all magazines of the broad left who supported democratic movements in Eastern Europe.
In British collections, I can't actually remember. I have found quite a lot about Poland. I mean, that's already when I was doing my actual habilitations first project. I did see a lot of in these British publications about Poland, less so about Ukraine, but I definitely will take another look at those.
Emena?
Well, thank you very much. It was a very, very interesting talk. And one of the things that I've been thinking a lot about myself, and you mentioned several times, is, and I completely agree, the need for these decolonial critiques of the field of Eastern European studies. And I wonder if you find the same problem that I come across when I try to do that, or other people I know try to do decolonial critiques. Because like with any critique, you need a certain methodology. And when you look at the methodology, for example, there's a book from 2000 by Eva Thompson that I'm sure you have heard of, and she gave a talk at the Institute. It was an online talk. So she wrote a book which uses such a decolonial critique. There's an earlier book by someone called Susan Layton, I think. Mm-hmm. And if you look at both books, and I'm sure many other studies in the field, basically you see that they go back to Edward Said and Saidian methodology. But you know, Edward Said is doing something which is very, very specific, and he says so, that he's looking at the very specific cases of French and English colonialism, where you have, like, you know, the British going to India, and you have a sense of the other, where you come from a superior civilization, the other is inferior culturally, and so on. And this is not exactly what is happening in respect to Ukraine. You know, the way that Russian propaganda constantly represents Ukrainians is like confused Russians. So they are Russian, but they claim that there's something else because there's some malign foreign influence and so on. But in any case, it's a very, very different type of situation as you're looking down on the other, and there's racism and a color line and all the rest of it. And I think when you're using this Saidian methodology, you can get a lot of useful things out of it. But it is meant to describe something which is fundamentally quite different. And I think that, you know, it's easy to say in a way we need to decolonize. Of course we do. I come from Bulgaria, and you know, I became a specialist on Russian icons, not because we don't have Bulgarian icons, but because the field is so much better developed and nobody wanted ever to hear about Bulgarian icons. So I have a lot of sympathy for that, but I think that if we lack the methodology, it's very difficult to do. So my question to you is, do you think that there is a need of developing a serious systematic methodology that deals with this specific situation, which is different from usual colonial context?
I think there are like two questions in that. So, I mean, Said was interested in kind of the colonial production of knowledge about the colonized people. That's what was his theme, and that's what he did with the example of French and English British colonialism, and that's not what I'm doing in my book. I'm not what I mean. Obviously, it plays a role. I mean, it's like the Soviet source is constantly about Ukrainian crazy nationalists who are extremely dangerous. So of course, this kind of Russian colonial discourse about Ukraine, about Ukrainian independence, it plays a role. But my question is really much more about Ukrainian and Polish agency and about these sources and about how they thought. So I think those are two interrelated but different topics. And what I see is kind of the decolonial in my approach is to make visible these perspectives which are under-researched and under-represented. Not a critique. I mean, I don't think I would add that much new basically. If I just kind of looked at how Soviet Russian sources present Ukrainian nationalism in the 1980s, it's very similar to what's happening today. It's not very original. It has a long tradition. I mean, there's already been a lot of work done on the kind of production of the image of the Ukrainian nationalist in the Soviet Union. Kai Struve, my colleague, is also working on this right now. But the other thing, and I think that is very also relevant for me, is this question: is Western colonialism fundamentally different from Russian colonialism? And I think there is the assumption that it is. And I think that is also the reason why I would argue, again, I hope not too many of my colleagues watch this video, but why I think we have an underdeveloped theory of colonialism in my field. Because the kind of the paradigm of colonialism is so much centered on the French and British history that we kind of look at Russia and say, well, it's not that, so it's not colonialism. And I think that's wrong. It's a different kind of colonialism, and sometimes if you look at Turkestan, 19th century, Konstantin von Kaufmann, it's not that different. It's only instead of a C, you have a step, basically. But I think it has a different logic in that Russian colonialism, at least in specific context, is about making, and not so much historians, but that Volodymyr Yarmolenko, some Ukrainian philosophers, has written about this, that the specificity of the Russian colonialism, at least to Belarusians and Ukrainians, is about making them the same. But this is also colonial, because there's also a hierarchy, there's a power imbalance, and I think this is kind of structural power imbalance which is embedded and also in the Soviet Union. And that actually also comes back to my theory, which I can't prove, that it's maybe more difficult for people who have worked on the Soviet Union for a Russian perspective. I was talking to a friend of mine, an Italian philosopher. Our kids are friends, and she was very interested in my work. And I told her about the Soviet Union as a colonial empire. And at some point she said to me, "So wait a minute. So some of your colleagues disagree that it was a Soviet colonial empire? They don't think it was colonial?" And I said, no, they think it's not colonial. And she said, well, it's completely obvious that it's colonial. That's from a complete outsider's perspective. She thought it was so obviously colonial. But from an insider's perspective, if you're so much kind of to this, accustomed to this Russian narrative, also in the 19th century, it's kind of, that I can talk a lot about that because my PhD was on this, was related to this. This concept of self-description as the Russian Empire as something fundamentally different from the Western and from the English and French perspective. This constant self-description as tolerant in the 19th century, and the constant self-description as anti-colonial in the Soviet Union. And when you look at it structurally, you do have the constant privileging of, apart from this short period in the 1920s, but already then they were obsessed of monitoring Ukrainian nationalists. You have this power imbalance and the structural privileging of Russian language and culture. And that is the reason why dissident movements in the non-Russian republics are always tied to national rights. And it's also the reason why the Russian dissidents don't get it in the Soviet Union. Because who cares about nationality? Nationality is going to go away. It's not. But from a privileged position, when your language is not under threat, you can say this. But as a Ukrainian, or not to speak of Crimean Tatars, it's not possible. It's fundamentally linked to your language, your culture, your history, and I think is my colleague Martin Kislev has written about this from Kiev. Said it's to do this is also to actually think about that the reason why we don't know these perspectives and sources is sometimes quite simply because the people have been killed. The Crimean Tatar language, the Crimean Tatar academics who start to write in the 1990s write about the genocide of their language in Russian. So it's also about kind of what he had this great formula of saying it's about restoring of epistemological justice, to see this and to try to recover it nonetheless.
Ambassador Hill.
All right, well, first of all, I think it's a fabulous topic because I don't think there's been enough done on this Polish-Ukrainian interplay. I mean, two countries who have quite a victim narrative to tell, and if you look at Polish attitudes to Ukraine, I mean, you mentioned that solidarity coalition of intellectuals, workers. You can extend that to farmers, of course. And we've seen that flare up with Ukrainian sales that have undermined markets for Polish farmers. So it continues to this day. The other element of this extraordinary coalition within Poland was the church.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And sometimes the church could play, especially the Krakow-based, more cosmopolitan, I mean, where the Pope came from. That played a very different view from the village priest, who was maybe not the most enlightened person in the village. So their view of a Ukrainian Orthodox church was not very positive at all. Polish, workers didn't care that much. I mean, to the extent Lech Wałęsa talked about the Soviet Union, he talked about trying to kind of calm things down. We'll build relations with them, it'll be fine. It was these Polish intellectuals, who, by the way, many were Jewish, so they had a lot of issues with what has gone on in Ukraine, especially in World War II. But I think they ultimately understood, as one of them said to me, Russia with Ukraine is the Soviet Union. Without Ukraine, they're just Russia, implying we can handle that, we just can't handle another Soviet Union. And so a very sort of nuanced view within this crazy coalition. But a couple of other things were happening, and I think this concept of empire and of kind of giving assignments to the periphery of the empire, you'll produce steel, you'll do this, you'll do that, in the context of a totally collapsing economy, also, I think, really got the Poles to think, we have our problems, but we've got to get out from under this. I mean, a joke back at the time was Jaruzelski goes up to Gdańsk, says to a guy's getting on a ship, what are you taking to Russia? Well, we're taking coffee, tea, and Polish coal. And he said, very good. And what are you bringing back? Well, we don't know. We're walking back. So it was the concept that Russia, Soviet Union, was simply raping the Polish economy. So today you see Poland in a way that we're not really seeing in Slovakia, we're not seeing at all in Hungary, and we're probably may not be seeing in Czechia. Poland understands that Ukraine must succeed, and they have become, I think, the biggest advocates. I was stationed in Serbia, and it was only when it came to light that the Serbs were selling lots of munitions through us for Ukraine did Tusk actually come and visit Serbia. So I think it's a very much of a dynamic that I hope, Tusk is a very sensible guy who gets the need to work with the Ukrainians, but it's not a marriage made in heaven. So.
Yeah, no, I mean that's obviously the case. So it's, but I think it's, I mean, and what I presented now are these kind of very productive sides of Polish-Ukrainian relations in the 1980s, and of course there is another side. There's also this. There also, you can find many examples until this day of also a kind of arrogance towards Ukrainians as kind of less cultured than Poles and so on. But when you kind of look at the history from basically Polish nationalists in the 19th century, not that dissimilar from Russians claiming that Ukrainians is just a variation of the Polish nation, to this is something structurally very, very different. And as for, I was going to say something clever, but I forgot. Oh yeah, and I think what I mean I was also thinking about this. So why? Because I was actually in Warsaw during the full-scale invasion, and it was completely fascinating to watch at the same time the Polish and the German discourse, because it was so different. And of course this had a lot to do with the history of Poland, of kind of understanding that sometimes you have to fight for your freedom, and sometimes you don't have another option than to fight. And also a completely different reaction. Oh, well, some Germans, but like many German intellectuals, it's kind of saying, oh, this whole bravery thing the Ukrainian soldiers are doing, I feel very uncomfortable. And Polish commentators thinking, wow, that is something. Yeah, we like this. And of course, it has a lot to do with their own history, of kind of just a recognition of what it's like to fight an anti-imperial struggle, basically. But at the same time, I also think that is one very important aspect. But I also think it's important to say that this is more than just a common enemy. Because it's all, and I think this is very fundamental to like my liberal solidarity intellectuals in the 1980s, that it really is also about the vision for a future Poland. It's tied in the Ukrainian-Polish reconciliation in this specific view is tied to a liberal Poland, and I think it's always tied to a political project. Of course, kind of, how do you say, in competition with other more kind of conservative, racist projects. But for them, this is integral to a liberal Poland. But I'm always very grateful for experts on Poland commenting on my work, because I always feel a little bit out of my depth.
I see 3 hands, and I'll take them all together because we're closing in. So at the back, the lady there first.
Thank you for your talk. I'm not an historian. I'm Mikhail Gorbachev. I'm based in Utrecht, and I work within the field of literature. The 1980s is also the time when Soviet Russia supports the liberation struggle, for example, in South Africa, and Mandela's party. And it's a very simple question: how does that legacy complicate your decolonial approach?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, then here, this gentleman.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'll try to be very short. And when I saw the name of the discussion, it was very obvious to me why Ukraine, Poland, and Eastern Europe would fit together as an entry point into this analysis. But then during discussion, because it is so obvious, actually I'm more interested why it is so obvious that we could analyze them together in these relations and try how was this entry point in a way to your analysis, these relations. And because I'm coming from Georgia, and you mentioned this geography and how it shapes political imaginary. And I was thinking in the end of 90s, when there was the anti-Soviet movement in Georgia, whom Georgian intellectuals or leaders of this liberation movement looked at was interestingly not Ukraine, not somewhere closer in a way geographically, but we looked at the Baltics.
Yeah, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Right? We had them coming over, there was many speeches, they were going there, this whole Helsinki and everything. So we looked at the Baltics, which I never questioned, but now I was more curious why we looked at the Baltics and not Ukraine, for example. So my question would be why Ukraine looked in a way, or like how does these relations try to explain the demise of Soviet Empire?
Mm-hmm.
And there was a final question in the back there. There was a hand. So I didn't see it properly, so we'll stay and conclude on those 2 questions. And
well, I think that the first question is pretty straightforward. I mean, the Soviet Union didn't rule South Africa. It was not part of their colonial empire. I mean, they were always kind of prepared to support political struggles outside of the Soviet Union if they saw any way of that it would boost their legitimacy or boost their credibility, which they had for a long time, especially among left-wing intellectuals, is that they really were an anti-colonial power. So I don't think it in any way collides with seeing the coloniality and Soviet Union policies towards Ukraine. And as for the Baltics, I mean, the Baltics are also, I mean, it's always this thing when you choose a perspective. I'm not trying to say it's not important, because actually it's funny that you say that Georgia looked towards the Baltics, because just a couple of months ago I hosted a discussion with Maxim Butkiewicz, the Ukrainian human rights advocate and journalist who was in a prison of war for 2 years after he joined the after he joined the Ukrainian armed forces after the Russian full-scale invasion, and we were talking.
We had him here
oh right, yeah.
recently, yeah.
So we were talking about him because he's. I mean, there's a lovely video of him as a 15, 16-year-old where he addresses the revolution of revolution on granite of 1990, where the students gather in Kiev, Maidan, and then this little Maxim, like 14 or 15 years old, addressing them and saying, oh, we school students also support you. And then we were talking about this period in his life, and he said the same thing. He said he was in some kind of a sanatorium in this time, and he was listening on the radio to what was happening in Vilnius. And then the nurse came in and said, what are you doing? You're supposed to be sleeping. And he said, I'm listening to what's happening in Vilnius. And she said, okay, let's listen together. So this kind of, if that they're also looking towards Poland doesn't mean that they're not also looking, of course, to the Baltic states, because they're the forerunners. I mean, the Baltic states are the ones who and this is perhaps also tied to this question of political imagination. It's, of course, never accepted the legal basis. Well, there wasn't no legal basis, but always kind of stressed the illegality of the Soviet takeover in 1914, and that, of course, independence of the Baltic states was feasible and a political possibility. And this is one of the reasons my colleague Una Bergman has written a great book about which I'm very indebted to also, about the Baltic states in this period. So yeah, Poland is really important, but also when we look at the Soviet republics within, the republics within the Soviet Union, of course the Baltic states would be where you look. But I think this would take a collaborative approach, that we really should look at the interconnectedness of Ukraine, the Baltics, Georgia, Kazakhstan, and how this. But we need to do this together, because none of us can do all the languages on their own.
Terrific. So before I invite you for wine and cheese, please join me in thanking Franziska for this wonderful evening.
Thank you very much.